All right, let's get started here. Thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon. I am Danielle Lipinski of the Maryland League of Conservation Voters, and I want to welcome you to today's media teleconference on the release of Maryland LCV's third and final Governor's Report Card and our 2021 Legislative Environmental Scorecard. You should have received email copies of the reports, and they are now available on our website at mdlcv.org. Our speakers today are Lynn Heller, Chair of our Maryland LCV Board, and Kim Coble, Maryland LCV's Executive Director. Once our speakers go over the details of the report, we will provide plenty of time for your questions. Please type them into the Q&A and we will answer them at the end. We also have other experts on the call to help answer your questions, including our Political Director, Kristen Harbison, and our Deputy Executive Director, Ramon Palencia Calvo, who also directs our Chiefs of Maryland program. Our first speaker today is Lynn Heller. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Danielle, and welcome to all of you. I'm Lynn Heller, the chair of the Maryland LCV board, and in my day job, I run a nonprofit green bank that focuses on increasing low-income households' access to clean energy statewide. I want to start by saying a bit about the report cards. Maryland LCV has been issuing a governor's report card and legislative scorecard for 4 decades. This year, we took a particularly focused look at 4 priority areas for our state: energy policy, transportation, environmental justice, and land and water protection. The goals of these reports in general are to provide Marylanders with information to make informed voting decisions so that committed conservationists are elected, and to inspire our elected officials to advance legislation that protects our natural resources and our communities. These report cards have their limitations in that we can only score our elected officials on the votes they actually take and the bills that are in fact introduced. In a minute, Kim Coble will talk briefly about the process we follow, but the bottom line is that to meet today's environmental challenges, all of our legislators need to be bolder and more strategic than ever before. That is because we are dealing with a new reality. Simply stated, the existential threat of the climate crisis demands urgent and meaningful action from our elected officials at all levels. As you all are aware, the impacts of climate change are increasingly apparent in Maryland, where flooding and increasingly intense storms and heat waves jeopardize communities from the Eastern Shore to Western Maryland. And pollution exacerbated by climate change contributes to a growing number of code red air days that threaten school children and others in Baltimore and in suburban neighborhoods adjacent to our congested transportation corridors. Maryland was once on a strong path to becoming a national climate leader with greenhouse gas reduction goals that were among the nation's strictest. Unfortunately, though, the state has faltered over the past decade, and these failures in addressing climate change are among the key themes we will be discussing today. Both our 2021 Legislative Environmental Scorecard and our governor's 7-year report card reflect a failure of leadership among our elected officials to meet the challenges of today's climate crisis. At the same time, the reports show areas in which progress has been made when 2 branches of our state government work together. I will now hand it off to Kim Coble to share the details of our 2 reports. Kim?
Thank you, Lynn. Thank you, Danielle. I'm Kim Coble, the Maryland Executive Director for the Maryland League of Conservation Voters. And it's a pleasure to be here. As Lynn mentioned, I'm going to go through the process that we used for each report, as well as the findings, and then touch on some key next steps we believe both the administration and the Maryland General Assembly need to take. Regarding the process, as Lynn said, we've put out a report card on the governor this year. It encompasses an assessment of the legacy of the Hogan administration over the last 7 years, between 2015 and 2021. This is different than the legislative scorecard, which is just an assessment of the past year. We looked back over the last 7 years. We compiled a list of legislative actions and administrative actions that the administration has taken over the last 7 years. That list came from partner groups and organizations, as well as the administration themselves. We culled that list and we selected many actions and bills based on the significance and impact of the decision to both communities and environmental health. So that was the criteria we used in selecting which ones we ranked. In terms of environmental justice, we looked at each of the actions and bills and said, what were the implications from an environmental justice lens? And that's how we developed the environmental justice score. With the legislative scorecard, as I said, this is a different report. We do this every year, and it's based on just the past legislative session. So each session, the environmental community tracks close to 100 bills. With our partner groups, we selected those top priority bills that had both environmental impact and also were key indicators of how our legislators were doing when it came to conservation voting. Our scorecard typically focuses on the votes of individual legislators. That's how historically we have done it. In 2020, due to COVID and a shortened session, we did not do that. Rather, we gave a letter grade to the Maryland General Assembly. This year, we have combined both approaches. We've given a letter grade to the Maryland General Assembly, and we have scored individual legislators. So that's included in the scorecard. In each report, we categorize the bills and issues that we looked at under under 4 umbrellas. One is climate/energy policy. One is climate/transportation, land and water protection, and environmental justice. As Lynn mentioned, we also took a look at where bills did not move forward, what we didn't have votes on, where there was an inability to come up with compromises. And this, we'd like to acknowledge that this is a limitation in the process, and therefore in our reports. We cannot score a bill that is not brought up for a vote. And we recognize this, we acknowledge that this is a shortcoming, and just wanted to point that out to you as well. So turning now to findings, the governor's report card, 2015 to 2021, how the administration has done during those years. One thing to acknowledge is that over that 7-year period, there's been some extraordinary events, the Freddie Gray incident, the pandemic, and also working under the controversial Trump presidential administration. From an environmental perspective, however, the past 7 years have been marked by a growing recognition of the threat of the climate crisis. It's accelerating, and there's an urgency for an aggressive action that needs to take place at every level of government. As it was demonstrated, climate change is an issue that crosses all party lines, and it also requires the cooperation between the administration and the General Assembly. The General Assembly will pass a bill, but the administration must sign the bill as well as be responsible for the implementation and funding of it. So we cannot make progress without cooperation between these two bodies. The Hogan administration did take some positive actions. However, more is needed. In particular, they have not adequately met the challenge posed by the climate crisis. This is particularly troubling for Maryland. We are very vulnerable to climate change, with over 3,000 miles of shoreline and over 265,000 acres of land that is less than 5 feet above sea level rise. We are very vulnerable, including, and in particular, Maryland's low wealth communities and communities of color are particularly at risk. The full scope of the Hogan administration's record over the last 7 years is mixed. His positive actions were overshadowed by inconsistent environmental leadership and a failure to adequately staff environmental compliance offices. This is especially important because this is their sole responsibility. The General Assembly is not responsible for adequately staffing. The executive branch alone is. So this is a very important shortcoming in our minds. The specific findings for the Hogan administration over the past 7 years, when it comes to fighting climate change and energy policy, the Hogan administration has gotten a B-. The high points for the administration in this area was support for offshore wind and renewable energy, and improved emission standards for methane, and the signing and advancing of the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Act. The low points in this area was a veto in 2016 of the Clean Energy Jobs Act and inconsistent actions on legislative pursuits towards climate policy. When it comes to fighting climate change and transportation, we've given the Hogan administration a D. The unilateral cancellation of the Baltimore Red Line was a reason for this, the veto of the Transit Safety Investment Act, and a consistent underfunding of transit across the board and prioritizing highways over public transit resulted in that grade. Environmental justice, we gave the Hogan administration a D. Fortunately, the Commission for Environmental Justice and Sustainable Communities was reinvigorated in 2021. However, prior to this, the poor performance of this commission is noted. It met infrequently and was slow to respond. The chronic understaffing of enforcement actions within agencies, we feel is a direct comment about environmental justice priorities. And perpetuates the structural disparities of pollution impacts on low wealth communities and communities of color. In the category of land and water protection, we've given the Hogan administration a C. And we want to acknowledge that the consistent and ongoing support and funding for program Open Space and the Bay Restoration Fund. The low points are, again, a decrease in enforcement actions, a chronic understaffing of enforcement staff, and stated goals to a compliance assistance over actual enforcement has hurt our land and water. In the final analysis, we particularly lament the administration's missed opportunity to position Maryland as a national leader in addressing climate change. This shortcoming is particularly troubling because of the tremendous threats facing our state. Moving now to the legislative scorecard, which assesses the legislators' votes over the past during the 2021 General Assembly. Without a doubt, the legislature's most notable failure was its inability to, once again, for the second year in a row, successfully pass comprehensive climate legislation. We were heartened by the General Assembly's commitment to taking steps towards advancing environmental justice and advancing strong election laws to ensure robust elections. And we are grateful to the General Assembly for strong actions on improving public transportation, including funding for the Transit Safety Investment Act. The Chamber's scores are as follows. Climate change, energy policy, they received a D. The high point for this category was passing legislation that requires the Public Service Commission to consider climate and labor standards when making decisions, and expanding net metering limits to encourage further solar development. Unfortunately, the low point was a catastrophic failure of cooperation and communication on the Climate Solutions Now Act. For the fighting climate change in transportation, the General Assembly received a B. We again acknowledge the bipartisan passage of the Transit Safety Investment Act, as well as the Zero Emission Bus Transition Act, ensuring the increased reliability of our public transportation system, as well as the health and safety of its riders. The low point was a failure by the Senate to pass the electric school bus pilot study, which would have protected the health of school children. In the category of environmental justice, the Maryland General Assembly receives a B. The high point was the steps they took to improve the membership and the mandate of the Commission on Environmental Justice and Sustainable Communities, and strong election reforms that improve access to voting for all Marylanders. And the low point was a missed opportunity to even make the Commission on Environmental Justice and Sustainable Communities stronger. There were opportunities that they did not seize. And additionally, the Senate failed to pass an amendment that would have removed subsidies for waste to energy incinerators. And in the land and water protection category, the Maryland General Assembly gets a C. There, on the high point, there was bipartisan passage of a stormwater management bill, which includes guidance documents to reflect the increased impacts of climate change on our state, and the passage of legislation to plant 5 million new trees throughout the state. The low point was the House passage of a bill that would have increased deforestation in the state, and the failure of the Senate to once again pass a bill that would ban plastic bags. So what is needed? With a climate reckoning upon us and our communities suffering, Maryland needs to act now to reposition itself as a national leader in equitable climate solutions. We specifically recommend the next gubernatorial administration must boldly commit to and implement a comprehensive and equitable environmental strategy that prioritizes clean energy and the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. Most notably, we know that transportation and buildings are the leading sources of climate-altering emissions in Maryland. State agencies must develop programs to ensure state buildings and transportation systems are net zero by 2040. Additionally, responding and adapting to and mitigating climate impacts should be seen as a top priority for the next administration and should be evidenced by budget and procurement allocation and a cabinet level climate office. Turning to the Maryland General Assembly, they too need to prioritize reductions from the two largest sources of greenhouse gas emissions, buildings and transportation, by ensuring state buildings and systems reach net zero by 2040, and infrastructure spending supports the greenhouse gas reduction commitment. They must also address disproportionate impact from greenhouse gas emissions on low wealth communities, many of which are Black and Brown, by ensuring the meaningful participation of impacted community members in funding and environmental justice decisions. In closing, we challenge the Maryland General Assembly and the governor in his final year to be bold and courageous leaders in addressing Maryland's most pressing environmental problems. They must pass legislation to aggressively pass climate goals and the programs that we need in place to achieve them. And environmental justice must be front and center for the state's climate plans. We look forward to working with both the governor's offices and the Maryland General Assembly for equitable climate solutions. Danny, I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks so much for that, Kim. So now we're going to have a brief time to get some questions. If you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A, and I'll give a few moments for that. Otherwise, thank you so much for your time. We've been asked to record today's press conference, and we will be sending out a copy this afternoon. And in the meantime, if you think of any other questions, we are available here to you to answer them. And so please feel free to reach out to me. So thank you all so much today. This concludes our webinar. Have a great day. Bye, everybody.